Hey folks, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about fight, flight, freeze, or flow. Okay, so everybody knows the saying fight or flight, and what I want to do is I want to relate this to experiencing our emotions, because fight or flight is typically related to the mind, right? When we experience fear, so we mentally either fight or we mentally run, right? And it protects our physical being. So I want to actually relate this concept to the emotional body and how we can start to have an understanding of our emotions. So the intention of this video is essentially to teach you guys about the term repression, which is another word for numbing or checking out or distracting ourselves from our emotions because we don't want to experience them because they're undesirable. So this is when we start to learn how to remove this whole defense mechanism, this psychological defense mechanism of repression, we can start to learn to allow ourselves to not fear pain, and we take the resistance out of it, and we can start to step into our happiness. Okay, so this is the intention of this video. So first off, I want to explore with you guys the difference between how the mind experiences fear and how the soul experiences fear, or the emotional body of fear. So the mind has this mechanism built into it to protect the physical body, which is fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so fight would be you stay in that confrontation, you face that fear and you fight it. Freeze would be you experience fear and it basically just cripples you. You're frozen. You're not quite sure how to respond. And then fight or flight would be basically you take off. You don't want to deal with it, so you remove yourself from it. So repression would be a form of flight. So we are actually running from our emotion. We don't want to experience it, and we push it and shove it away. Okay? So the difference, there's a fine balance in between flight and fight when it comes to the emotions, because you can fight your emotions, but what that does is you're bringing resistance into a situation, and you're going to create more pain and more suffering because you're trying to push something away by fighting it versus running from it, right? So either way, there's a push or there's a resistance to having to sit with this and experience it. What we need to understand about emotions is that they're very valuable to us. They're teachers, they're guides that are showing us exactly, our path, and they're guiding us to exactly where we need to be. So when we have these emotional experiences come to us, if we choose to avoid them, we're deaf to the voice of our soul, essentially, because our soul is trying to speak to us through emotions and teaching us, okay, this is good for us, this is not. And it speaks to us through our intuition, and if we're shut off our emotions, then we're also shutting off our intuition, because our intuition speaks to us through our emotions. So really, at the end of the day, this is the mindset shift we need to make when it comes to repression, because when we repress, we are distracting ourselves, and we don't have to sit with the immediacy of the emotion, the immediacy pain of the emotion, but we're creating more dysfunction and more stuckness in our future, because we're not allowing ourselves to evolve and shift with time and space, and we're basically pulling ourselves further and further away from our center, right? And this is what life is about. Life is about spiritual evolution and taking us to a place of our destiny, or whatever we're meant to step into. We're taking ourselves further and further away from that. So when you have this experience of repression, you're really creating a conflict between your head and your heart, right? Because your heart is trying to speak to you, but your head is saying, no, I don't want to listen, and you shut off, you engage in your cell phone, food, drugs, sex, whatever it might be, and then we feel stuck. This is when people do this really is a form of addiction, because we're actually staying emotionally stuck at the time that we choose to start using repression as a way to cope. We get stuck emotionally and spiritually at that time because we're not allowing the evolution of our feelings to evolve us, essentially. So the fight or flight and freeze is mechanisms of the mind. Okay, it's mechanisms of the ego. The ego is the mechanism built inside of our mind that's to preserve us. It's a sense of holding on and not letting go, because if you let go, then you're going to be put in a place of the unknown, where there could be more things to fear. That's what the ego is telling you. So that's why we hold on. That's why we choose not to let go. But what we need to understand is that the ego is the mechanism that's also preventing us from allowing us to feel. Okay? So fight, flight, or freeze is mechanisms of the ego. Okay? Mechanisms of the heart and soul is going to be flow. So the heart and the soul want to flow, because this is the part of our being that doesn't have the ego mechanism built into it that tells us that there's things to fear, because the heart and the soul really are infinite. They aren't disturbed by the same things that the mind is disturbed by, which is limiting beliefs and fears and past hurts and things like that. They're not stored in the heart. They're not stored in the soul. They are stored in the mind when it comes to fear, right? The heart knows the language of love, and so does the soul. It's the same energy. And what we need to learn to do is to allow our emotions to continue to flow, and we are going to continue to evolve and learn and grow through that process. So what ends up happening when we don't allow ourselves to flow is we end up creating more suffering for ourselves, because the human mind is always looking for ways to experience pleasure. We don't want to experience pain, so the human mind does anything in its power to be able to not experience pain. And when we aren't in touch with our heart energy or our soul energy, we end up becoming stuck in the one that we know and the one that we resort to. It's our default energy, which is our mental energy. And that energy is always trying to preserve us from having to experience suffering. But what we need to understand is most of the suffering that we're creating for ourselves is the suffering that we think that we need to be always seeking pleasure. Pleasure. But what we don't really understand is that in this pursuit of pleasure, that's where pain actually comes from. Because we're creating a division in our experiences by telling ourselves that we don't want to experience pain, we want to experience pleasure, so we're creating a contrast between the two. You have pain and you have pleasure, but what we need to understand is that in our pursuit of pleasure, that's where we're actually getting stuck. We're creating a lack of flow by always seeking and only seeking things that bring us pleasure, right? But that mental pursuit of pleasure is the pain, because we're saying that we cannot be happy without pleasure, or without this pursuit of pleasure being fulfilled, right? That's our attachment to desire. The attachment to desire is what causes pain and suffering for people, because we tell ourselves the story that if I don't receive pleasure, I'm in the absence of happiness, right? But the key to understanding happiness is that there's nothing outside of you that brings you happiness. It might bring you temporary states of happiness, but it won't bring you that ultimate joy that we feel inside of our being. And if you actually pause for a moment when something joyful happens in your life, and you pause and you go within, you actually realize that this ball of joy has been inside of you. It's been inside of you right here all along, and this external stimuli actually just created an excitement of that ball of energy, and it created it to start to move and shift. What we don't understand, or what people tend to have a hard time wrapping their head around, is that ball of energy has been inside of you all along. Right? And as we seek these things externally, we create moments of excitement, but we can create that for ourselves without needing external stimuli. What the mind is telling you is the opposite of that story. The mind is telling you that it needs to continue to seek, and pursue pleasure, so you can have these experiences over and over and over again. But what ends up happening is you start to realize the futility in that. It becomes a chase. You're chasing and you're hustling for joy in your life, when really you can take the soulful approach and just tune in. Right? That's the inner work. That's working from the inside out as opposed to working from the outside in. And this is the journey that we all are trying to get on, because at the end of the day, every action that we have taken since birth has been to get happiness in our lives. And there's not one single action that we have partaken in our lives that it wasn't fueled by the pursuit of happiness. So next time you experience joy based off of an external stimuli, I want you to follow that in your body. Follow that and see where that takes you, and learn. That's how we learn how to cultivate joy, and that's how we learn to cultivate happiness. Authentic happiness is by learning from these external sources how we can start to move inward and start to move into a place of desirelessness, which is really the ultimate surrender and the ultimate freedom from this trap, this social construct that we've created in our minds, that we need to be always seeking pleasure. So I want to wrap this back around to repression, because that's how I want to finish off this video. Is when we go into a place of running from our emotions, we tell ourselves the story that our emotions are undesirable, and through that story we divide from our emotions, we divide from our experiences, and we create an enemy out of them. And what that does is it brings resistance into our emotional being. And when we have resistance to our emotional being, we view our emotions, which are an extension of ourselves, which are ourselves, we view them as not desirable. And that's how we start to view ourselves as non-desirable, which is going to feed into the shame. It's going to feed into the I'm not good enough story that we tell ourselves. So really, the remedy to this is to learn to sit with your emotions. And you'll start to notice when you bring acceptance into your emotions that they immediately start to dissolve. When you bring acceptance into pain, even physical pain in your body, when you bring acceptance into that physical pain, you're going to notice that it's going to dissipate. What ends up happening is when we have some sort of pain going on in our body, if my arm is sore, I'm going to fixate on that, and I'm going to create a division. I'm going to say, I don't want this pain in my arm. So here's me, and here's the pain over here that I'm trying to push it away. Right? When we actually take it in and we become one with that pain, and we realize that this is the experience that we're meant to be experiencing right now, that resistance alone is going to help dissipate the physical pain. It's going to help dissipate the emotional pain, and it's going to help calm the mind. Okay? So that's going to be the biggest lesson in this, is stop running and start accepting. And the journey becomes way less difficult, and that's how we step into our joy and step into our authenticity, is by allowing these emotions to be part of our experience, so we can really, at the end of the day, just understand ourselves, and we can continue to evolve and continue to step into our authenticity. Because when we're shoving away parts of our being, our very important parts of our being, our emotional being, we're not allowing ourselves to step into our authenticity. And there is no better feeling than being able to stand in your authenticity and be proud of who you are in all aspects of your being, your physical, your mental, your emotional, and your spiritual. That's all I got for you today. Take care.